Thank you, Meera. Thank you, Mamta. And thank you for this wonderful panel that's come together today. And for everyone joining us fighting a post-lunch nap. The initial outline or direction given to us was a proposition to think about the ethical turn in the arts, something that is a shift, one that is kind of programming this textured, layered movement of sorts, and hence the turning. The proposition began by aligning this shift, this turn, with what Rancière calls a move away from dissensus, where art could be expected to be ethically legible and politically responsible. At the same time, interestingly, it also offered us a counterpoint, bringing in Claire Bishop's defense of art's right to negate, to sit with ambiguity, discomfort, and non-resolution. So this became the core conflict presented to us, and it invited responses, reflections to this sort of anxiety of ethics becoming prescriptive and dissensus becoming morally legible. So this conflict for us opened up new tangents of thought. The ethical turn in curatorial discourse has been frequently invoked as an orientation that foregrounds a kind of responsibility, a testimony, and a moral positioning within artistic and institutional practices. So instead of reading this turn as a settled paradigm, we approach it as a continuous movement, a series of fluctuations allowing us to lean into the ongoing negotiation between the contexts and frameworks through which art circulates. And we ask, what is it that emerges when we look beyond the now familiar polarity of ethical positioning and dissensus, where dissensus could be understood as the capacity of art, curating, and creative practice at large to stage disagreement, for instance, or hold space for it, space that is adaptable and listening. So bringing together curators whose practices move across discursive spaces, this conversation now asks how ethics and its trajectories of meaning enter curatorial practice as operation, pedagogy, performance, and governance. So drawing from experiences of exhibition and space making, the panel will reflect on how we might stage the frictions between ethics and aesthetics rather than simply resolving their tensions. Through an engagement with questions of criticality, complexity, ambiguity, and illegibility, we seek to ask, how may we respond to a hardening of responsibility into moral clarity? How might institutional pedagogies complicate the ethical demand rather than merely simply enforce it? So we're keen to look at how the speakers think and work with the realities of community, collaboration, and openness, themes that have also been a part of earlier conversations today, considering how these terms intersect with contemporary urgencies. And it will explore the dimensions also of third spaces in curatorial approaches today, critical terrains that unsettle hardened binaries between aesthetic autonomy and political responsibility, identities and their hyphenations, disciplines and institutional forms. And in doing so, the panel will reflect on the shifting vocabularies and instabilities of the curatorial role itself, asking how curating today might sustain complexity, ambiguity, and hopefully speculative political imaginations.
So it's very difficult for me to talk online and on Zoom because you are not actually enjoying the physical marvelous presence of your colleagues and the people, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there. I think apart from being a curator, I am the director of the art school in Basel. So it means that I am in direct contact, daily contact with very young people that they are right now super concerned and also feeling very anxious about the world. And it is their perspective that is actually teaches me more than I teach anybody about attitudes and languages that we can adopt. I've been, as a scholar of philosophy, I've been studying for many, many years with an assistant of Theodor Adorno. So I've been trained into ideas of morals, ethics, and of course of critical thinking. And yet I've been asking myself all the time, what is the position and the languages that we adopt, and from where do we adopt it? So I'm always very uncomfortable talking about morals and talking about ethics. And also I ask myself, who are those talking about it? From which angle are they actually addressing this type of questions? And I must say that coming from a very small village of the rural area, I think that it's very problematic when we adopt these kind of discourses that they seem themselves very close to power, that they are actually as if we could counteract as curators and practitioners what power itself is kind of narrating. And I don't know about you, but when you are talking to very young people, that they feel very ignorant and very powerless towards the situation and the things that are happening, they mostly feel silent, or they feel absolutely trapped into the binaries, as Sudha was describing, into the binaries of belonging to one side or the other. That everything is being presented in this kind of binary traps where you need to belong, otherwise you are not visible. And if you are not visible as a young artist or as a practitioner, then you don't have any effect. You cannot do anything at all. And this is something for me very problematic. And the same happens in rural areas. You know, when you go to rural areas, people are also not adopting this type of discourses. It's very difficult from people that they come from small villages to talk on behalf of a discourse that adopts the language of the state. So this is something that really is also very important to me. I think right now, in my opinion, we are facing a situation that we are at the end of, we are facing a situation where the discourses on the one hand is this type of scammers like Donald Trump that was described as the most important man in the world. I also would refrain to repeat this type of sentences that are ironic, but still I would not say them. So it's this type of discourse of the scammer that is now a president versus the hero or some type of figure that could counteract the scammer. And I think that as a woman, it's almost impossible to inscribe yourself in any of those groups. I think that it's super important for us to reflect on our limited action, but also how this limited action is a door and a window to the many possibilities that we have, not only to illustrate or to produce direct discourses that counteract as if we are also doing politics of a state, but going kind of in different levels of language and artistic practice and aesthetic practice in order to activate some different cognitive logic. In other words, I do believe that it is more necessary than ever to go to the exhibition format. I do believe that the exhibition format is not a format to present artworks actually, but to present them connected. And in the connectivity of the artworks, we are kind of activating something which is cognoscitive. And the possibility of getting to know, knowing differently through a sensorial space is political in itself. It's actually radically political because we are now facing major political transformations that coincide with major technological transformations. So the presence of our bodies in the space is not only just to visit an exhibition to get the subject, ideological or aesthetic subject of an exhibition, but actually to ask ourselves, what are our possibilities of knowing differently, of transforming the logics that have been actually framing our practice? So, on the one hand, we talk about ethical terms, and we also talk many times about best practices. I am a big opposer of those ideas or those types of talking. And I do think that every time that we talk about diversity and then we talk about best practice, we are kind of replicating corporative languages. So we shouldn't actually talk about or aspiring to the best. We should aspire to the most relevant. And I agree with Sudha that the most relevant is or it needs to be framed and it needs to be defined in relationship to your space and your time. And if your space is actually youth, is a different space than growing up. And if your space is economically deprived, it's a complete different space than if you are not economically deprived, and so on and so forth. So understanding the possibilities of expanding your space and expanding your practice inside where you are is for me a fundamental practice of the of the curator, I would say. And you activate it through the different practices and what the exhibition can do as a as a playground for cognitive science, if you want, for connecting differently. So some of the images that they are there, they belong to the Ljubljana Biennial that I did last year. And the lemma of the Ljubljana Biennial, like the image that you are seeing now, was how to do an exhibition to regenerate democracy. So the golden times of Ljubljana, which is in Slovenia, which is Eastern Europe, were the 50s. And in the 50s, one of the most prominent practice of that community was actually puppetry. Puppetry and storytelling and dramaturgy actually through proxies and not through the presence of humans. And the practice of the non-human is also very interesting because we have been talking about the non-human as nature, but the puppet is also a non-human, which is pre-technological, that is very interesting to talk about control and to talk about action and behavior. So in that exhibition, I was trying to also play with two notions that they have been very, that they have been repeated many times. One is imagination, which is a quite limited behavior of the mind, and the other one is fantasy, that is almost absent. And my idea was to use fantasy, which is totally wild and like non-controllable, much more different from imagination, as a potential tool for regenerating a thinking logic that would kind of provoke an idea of freedom. It's very difficult to explain all these ideas in a Zoom and with this distance because we can really not discuss them on depth. But I think that my whole practice has been actually trying to see in how far art and exhibitions can be used to motivate the civic society. So it is very important for me these days not only to make people aware of things and problems and to actually render visible many aspects, political aspects that I do believe they already know, but actually trying to make them feel that something different is possible, that there is the possibility of a sensorialization of the mind that would activate a different thinking logic. So, in a way, I do believe that exhibitions are technological tools. In other words, for me has been also very interesting how, for example, I was mentioning that I did study with Adorno in 1960, like in '69. When Adorno was actually already was finished with the writing of the German Constitution, he came back in the middle of the 50s. He has been very active in the possibility of regenerating Germany after the Holocaust and regenerating the texture of the civic society of Germany. But the last years of his life, he was teaching at the Goethe Institute, at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And it is so interesting that in these last years, Adorno instead of talking about political science and critical distance, he was dedicating his life to talk about like the like Greek theater, like ancient, like the tragic ancient drama. And because of that, he was highly criticized for the students. And actually, he was attacking one of the last lectures. And people say that because of that, he got a heart attack and he died some months later. So it is for me interesting that at the peak of the trauma of seeing a limit to how much can you do in a literal sense, we need to invent new languages and ways of reactivating space, the space that is really precious and it's really important. And that also this space should be activated not only following the logic of the discourse of the city and the urban context and the educated urban context where we possess a certain control about the notions and a certain control about the discourses of what should be said, and that we shouldn't actually co-opt the exhibition space into virtue signaling. Coming from a tradition of the left, I still think that is a big problem when we kind of really instrumentalize cultural spaces right now for virtual signaling, for telling people what is right, what they should think. Even if I agree with many of the signals that are being sent, I still think it would be much more interesting and important to expand and to try not to go into the present. So, in other words, I do believe that escaping the present, a little bit like Adorno, like going into different tactics that are beyond the current situation but refer directly to it in a different and completely different way, producing really amazing detours for us to think about it from the future, like projecting into a future that is about to come, that it could be disastrous or not. But it's important to resituate ourselves not in that kind of the now that everyone thinks that is urgent. So the question of urgency, it's absolutely there. But my question is if the question of urgency should be also be in the exhibition space. There is many answers to that, and there is many practices and many people that think that it should be. But polemically speaking, I do believe that actually it shouldn't. That right now is not the moment for that. And of course, I'm talking from Europe, which is completely polarized. And as Sudha was saying, many things are not possible in Europe. But also, I would remind you that things are not possible in some parts of Europe and are possible in some other parts. But importantly, what is happening is like a radical impossibility of communities talking to each other. So questions of dialogue are already perceived as selling off, as not being able to respond to the urgent and position yourself in one side or the other. So I think that the role of culture right now is fundamental. Really something that we really need. But we also need that space not only for a certain fraction of the social, we need that space to expand into communities that they lack even the language to situate themselves outside the space that they have been assigned. So if you belong to certain parts of the world and certain regions, certain social classes, you have been assigned right now a position that is very difficult to leave. It's very difficult to move, much more difficult perhaps than 20 years ago when politics and also the social climate was much more porous. But when this social climate belongs or starts to be very rigid, we need to assist to mobility. So I do think that actually exhibitions are transitional spaces, that they help people to move through different social, political scenarios, not through only one scenario. And I think that it's very important to preserve and to defend this fundamental democratic space, and to regenerate it with more than one narrative, to actually make it brutally plural right now, brutally diverse, and also appealing, sensorially appealing, so that people can think through those spaces about the positions that they may or they should adopt in order to be able to live together. So the question of coexistence is for me much more important than the question of morals right now, or the question of ethics, polemically speaking. So I don't know if it makes sense that I go on and on, because it's very dystopic to talk on Zoom, but perhaps if we do some questions.
Thank you, all three of you. I think it was very interesting for me to sit and see the ways in which the turn and its many sort of prepositions were coming through very vividly. And what I could see was also this tracing of attitudes, of stances, of relationships that we have to ethics in a very expanded sense as individuals, collectives, and gatherings. And I think Shuddha, something that you started with was the word sensitivities, which stayed. Things that we absorb, discard, reinvent as inspiration or as conveniences. And I think, Andrea, something that stayed with me was also the ability that you spoke of making space for doing things differently, which then I think was echoed with what you said about knowing differently is a political act in itself. So these sort of sievings for me were also very interesting because it was illustrating more of an enmeshment with rather than a polarity, and really thinking with these tensions, thinking with ambiguities. And I think it was interesting that refusal came up as a word, because I'd also preempted it in a way, and refusal being something that we're not necessarily seeing in an absolute sense, but in relation to so much, to civic society, as Chus was also talking about, in relation to the kind of transitional spaces that art is occupying. So something that, I wanted to kind of maybe just limit my question to one proposition as such, which could then be opened up and then invite questions in further. When we're thinking of a demand to platform something, does that flatten an artwork or an inquiry or a practice into evidence? Is that a tension that speaks to you at all? And in speaking to these demands, where does refusal come in? And I know that it was touched upon briefly, but it would be very interesting to then hear it expounded upon if possible.
So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think what you said before with the entanglement, so for me what's really interesting is that, and maybe it speaks to the platforming too, that so in my experience with the Egyptian context, it's so much going in cycles. So what is interesting to me with this film with Hossein Ali is, for Hossein Ali at the time, there was no other way to make a film. There was no other way to shoot on 35mm and have it out there and released unless you do it through the state. So it's a film criticizing the state, paid for by the state and released by the state. So how do you do that, right? So he has to do it in a way that we today get the message, but at the same time it has to pass the authorities at the time, right? And so this gesture is, I think, something I find I keep going back to, or our work keeps going back to, as to where are the moments in the past, or the friends in the past, or the allies in the past that we want to connect to, that also are, really deliberately erased. Why do we not know Hossein Ali in Egypt as a very well-known director? well, that's why, because they don't want us to see him. So this point of connecting to things in the past, I think, is a very important one, especially like, I feel we are a bit in a state like what he did to the film. So he somehow encapsulates this critique and the memory, the legacy of these protests and boycotts of Israeli pavilions. He smuggles that to the future in this film, right? And we, in the situation we are in, by being forced inside again, by being forced into working with smaller audiences again, we're doing something similar. So maybe this is how I can answer. Yeah.
Chus, can you hear us?
No. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you. And then I ask myself, what would it be if we advocate for radical togetherness? On the one hand, it's kind of very uncomfortable, this wish of consensus, and everyone wants to disrupt or boycott or make their voice visible, because then it signalizes criticality, and it gives at least the idea that this dissent is making sense and it's opening up towards something. But then what if we apply the idea of biodiversity to politics? I think if you think about a picture of a forest, the mushrooms would not move away from the picture. You need a picture that takes all the forest together. So what if we kind of, for a second, suspend the idea of the possibility of a radical togetherness, like in a forest, and all species are there, even those species that you really hate? What would that be? And I am working a lot with this type of, radical togetherness right now. Also, because of course, I'm working in an art school, and I think that we need to produce possibilities of young people of belonging while dissenting. So how do you do that? And that's something that, what is my problem is the idea that coherence can be made, that somebody is senseless and an idiot, and somebody else is actually having the sense that could be applied, and that we apply sense to reality as we apply chocolate to a cake. So this idea that sense is an ingredient is really wrong to me. I think that is a practice, and it's we need to live through complexity, and that means a radical uneasiness that needs to go through. And this radical uneasiness can only, I think, if you put yourself aside, if you polarize, it makes it for you easier. You are visible as the one that is better than the others. Virtue signaling, that's what I mean. I'm good. I've been applying for saint right now. And of course, as a practitioner or as an artist is one thing, but imagine the younger people that through social media, they are kind of co-opt into this kind of virtue signaling extractivism, that they are kind of invited to put their presence and their minds into one of those pots daily. So I think that for me, it's important to think differently about that. And I'm of course just, it's an exercise. There is no solution for that, but we need to exercise several things. And therefore, the true diversity is very important, because otherwise, nobody can exercise anything, because they cancel you if you think differently. So what happens if we start possibilitating different political exercises till we get into a new possibility of coexistence, political different logic, a resistance that actually does something instead of just signaling that it's doing something?
Thank you, Chus. I think togetherness and uneasiness, being on the same side of the conversation, becomes a very interesting point to also invite questions in, if there are any.
Thank you for the presentations. I have a question which I personally have been trying to grapple with for many years now, and I'd love to hear all of your thoughts, or at least some of yours, whoever wants to answer. And it's about the relationship between institutions, society, and the artist/intellectual, the last one often having occupied a place of autonomy. And if I can just further qualify this question, because, I mean, my own experience in the past 15, 17 years is moving between an independent institution, such as Asia Art Archive, to a private organization, such as the one in Dubai, to now a government entity in the Biennale, but which is highly dependent on private kind of outsourcing and things like that, and actually working quite on a model of, in fact, what one may say, like techno-feudal, the way Yanis Varoufakis describes. But anyway, so the question here being that even within institutions, we can see that there's the public institution, there's the independent institution, as there's the private institution. And we're seeing an increasing leaning towards the privatization of institutions. We can see that in the art field a lot with private organizations, which are different from independent organizations and certainly different from state or public organizations. And I mean, we've seen instances where a private organization/institution can turn around and say, you know, while we're public, this is how we like to do things, and we're answerable to ourselves only. And so how do you see the contradiction between institutions that are accessible to public versus that are accountable to publics? Because I think a lot of organizations seem to get away with, we're public, but just being publicly accessible, but not necessarily being publicly accountable. So I thought I'd ask you how you see the relationship between institutions in the landscape today with society and the artist/intellectual. And do you have any interesting examples of how these have been navigated interestingly with private organizations? And if you had a message to private organizations, being artists and curators yourself, what would that be?
It strikes me that, for example, in some contexts that kind of are producing hypervisibility for art, like let's say the UAE, how are we going to exactly define this, this definition? What is the private and what is the state? It's different to the traditional private and independent bourgeoisie thing and the state. So we all of these things are really to be, really revised, I feel.
Perhaps I can say something. Also, the dividing between the private and the state, which state? Because there is differences in states. The state in the Emirates is not the same as the state in Switzerland or in Spain. And also you can really look, are you referring to the state as in its current situation, or are you referring to a state tradition that has been shaping codes of conduct and also definitions of the common good, because it has been defined, for example, by democratic rules and systems and organizations and institutions? I think an institution is a form of organization. Everyone can form an organization and call it an institution. It depends how it forms. So, of course, we can change things from the inside, but it's also very important to be transparent on the ways that we organize ourselves. And, access to the public is not the same as being public. As you said, it's very different. So what do we name when we name the public? What is the texture of the civic? What is the kind of rights that we want to preserve through the practices? And of course, practitioners play a fundamental role, because one of the things that I care the most is commissions. It means working with living artists. Working with living artists definitely shapes the governance of institutions, whatever institution, because they bring their own ways of understanding and their practices, and they add complexity to the visions. Also, it is very different, a public institution in a democratic state where the director and the team are actually custodians for the rest of the citizenship than owners of private institutions. An owner and a custodian are two different things. And I think if you just give up ownership and produce a different set of governance, then also in the private sector, it would be possible to expand towards a much more hybrid, let's say, complex ways of understanding the interests that the institution is serving. Because at the end, an institution is also very limited. It's limited in its social space, it's limited in its social function, and this limitation makes it very soon also capable of being instrumentalized. So avoiding instrumentalization is something that in democratic states has been, it has been, let's say, revised by elections, by revisions, by motions of censorship from professional groups and lobbyists that oppose the state, how they are doing it, and so on and so forth. But can the same be done in private-owned institutions? Can you do the same against owners? And if you do the same against an owner, is the same type of revision or is an opposition, and then you are cancelled? So all this set of questions should be taken into account to produce a new mind map of governances in plural. And all these factors are super important, and also the goals that you have and how you define your constituency. So how you define your constituency is fundamental to understand the function that your institution that you are working in has, in my opinion.
On that note, thank you, Chus, for joining us virtually and for staying so engaged throughout. Thank you, Andrea and Shuddha as well.